So we know what front preload's for then, do we? It might not be for what you think it is. Manufacturers can use front preload in all sorts of different ways, and I'll go through a few examples here. That's why it's important not to assume they've put that front preload there for a particular reason. A lot of bikes come with front preload, even quite kind of cheap, entry-level sort of models. Quite a lot of Hondas. This thing has front preload on it. No damping adjustment, but it's got front preload adjustment. But the front preload might be there for various different reasons. Not all bikes use it in the same way. It is often used very much differently than the way we'd consider and think about rear preload. Let's think about rear preload, what we're trying to do. At 99 times out of 10 on a regular road bike, all we're trying to do with rear preload, let's say here's our rear shock. I'll get a bit closer. I've used this demo a few times now. Here's our rear shock, and here's the full stroke. Full stroke of our shock there. And we get on the bike and we sag the bike down a bit, and we might adjust the preload to get somewhere like 30% sag. And then we're going up and down the road, and our swing arm's doing this, compressing the shock. Great. And occasionally we go down a dip and we extend the shock a bit. So we get on the bike, and we set our rear preload to try, depending on whether we got a load, whether it's a passenger luggage, whatever it is, somewhere like 30% sag. Again, I'm not being prescriptive. You might choose 25, you might choose 35, but somewhere like this. That's not necessarily what's happening to the front or what you want to happen at the front. Let's go through some examples. In many instances, the front preload there is to adjust the geometry of the bike for the handling, not to try and achieve, say, some sort of 30% sag or 25% sag figure. This Honda here is quite sensitive to that front preload. You can change the tyres, you can change the profile of the tyre, change the load on the bike, and it's quite sensitive to the handling of the bike as that front end changes. So, the more we load in the back of the bike, we're sagging the bike down a bit at the back, we're hopefully compensating that with the rear preload. But at the end of the day, you go two up on this thing and you're kind of nosing this bike up a bit, and it tends to understeer quite markedly, I find. That doesn't help that I'm heavy. But so how you compensate for that on this is then drop the preload on the front. But you could be sitting 40, 50% down in your stroke on that front fork, and all that setting the 25%, 30% kind of sag thing is out of the window. It's like you forget about that. Okay, we say we've got 104 or 110, I can't remember what it is on that mil of travel on the front. You go, forget that. I'll blow through that preload if it gets my bike handling right. So that kind of going for the sag value on the front is kind of out the window a bit. Other bikes aren't so susceptible, and they say, look, we're going to take care of all of this at the back end. So my old Tiger 1200, no front preload adjustment. That GS 1250 behind, no front preload adjustment on that. Everything's done from the rear end. But these bikes might not have been quite so susceptible to changes in sag. Like those rear shocks, you do eventually overload them. Load those things to the gunnel, and you will have that nose sitting up on that GS and the last Tiger. You will affect the steering, you will affect the handling. But some bikes, as I say, are more susceptible to those changes than others. This I find very sensitive to its, the geometry of this bike is very important. When I first got on this bike, it was quite a slow steering bike. That front preload just had me sorted. So the sag values on this CB1100, when you put the preload in the stock position, you absolutely blow through the front end of that stroke on that thing, and it's kind of regular for the rear. So with my weight, I just add a bit more preload on the rear of this thing. That's great. That gets me to my kind of 30% sag on the back, but I'm probably down more like 45, 50% on the front end. But if I tried to bring that front end up back to the 30, I'd have this thing chop it out, and it's an awful steerer. So don't get too hung up about this 30% sag at the front. It's a nice thing to aim for to start with, see how your bike, if you can adjust it to that value, but it's not the be all and end all. Use that to change the handling of the bike rather than achieving a sag target. Now let's have a look at another example. My Daytona 1200. Hang on, moving now. Now my old Daytona here, my 95 Daytona 1200, I could get some proportionality on the front end and the rear. I could set the preload, give me about a 25% sag on the front and the rear. And that kind of got the suspension nicely balanced. But then what I would have done is taken this out for a few test rides. And once I decided how I felt the steering was, I would have kind of either, you know, given up some of my compression stroke or taken some of my compression stroke back. And I might have gone, you know, just 20% sag on here or like 30% sag, whatever it is. So I've got it in the ballpark. These are kind of, these front springs and the rear springs are more balanced. But then I had these springs and the rear shock put in for me and my weight. Yeah, that was a dead easy job, wasn't it? Yeah, like clockwork that job went. Did. A bit low. So it was kind of more likely that that was going to happen. So I can adjust these to have similar amounts of sag, but still at the end of the day, once I've got that rear shock set up, I'm going to modify, give up or take more of that front preload, use up more or less of my stroke to get the handling perfect. So the great thing about that front preload, get your handling perfect, brilliant. Let's have a look at the Aprilia Touareg that I had for a week or so. I love that bike. That was an absolutely fantastic bike. I really liked the suspension, a really long travel suspension. And I spent a good deal of time riding that on good roads, bad roads, mountainy roads, sussing out where I wanted that rear preload. When I first sat in it, I blew through that rear shock. I jacked up the rear preload. I got it a fair bit up there, got to around that kind of 30-35% sag mark, really liked it, thought the bike handled fantastically. But you read the owner's manual on that. If you go too up or take loads of luggage and really weigh that bike down, what Aprilia want you to do there is they have a preload adjustment on the front. They don't want you to touch it. They don't want you to touch it in any normal riding mode. But if you load yourself up to the gunnels, you're going to sit that rear end down, okay? Then obviously what we're going to do is jack that back up, adding rear preload, get the geometry of the bike back right. But what they're saying is look, we can't put a range of adjustment on that rear shock enough to compensate for that sag at the back. That Aprilia Touareg is going to chop her out a bit and slow the steering down a bit. So they've given you a front preload adjustment, and the idea, what they want you to do there is actually take some of the front preload off and lower the nose. Why might they do that? Why might they do that? Well, what it is, it's taken some of the pressure off the rear spring. It's taken, I don't mean actual pressure, it's taken some of the pressure off the designers, because now they can say, look, we don't have to make this rear spring be designed for every eventuality and every load. We're going to give that, maybe we can use a lighter spring rate, which is more suited to the bike and the weight it's going to carry. My camera's sliding down so I'm going to have to hold the bloody camera. So I'm not cutting that bit out because continuity and all that. So, all right, you don't have to explain. Yeah. So what they're doing on that Aprilia Touareg is saying, we're going to give that rear spring rate a helping hand. Let them choose a spring rate that is kind of more suitable to the use of the bike. We're going to give it a helping hand by allowing the user to take some front preload off when he's loaded up, get the geometry of that bike back right again. So again, it's not focusing on how much sag at those front forks. So just leave it. That's what they're saying. Just leave it unless you encounter this scenario. And of course, most of the action is happening at the rear end. You're sitting nearly over the top of that rear shock. Your luggage is sitting over the top of the rear shock or even behind it, and your pillion's sitting behind the rear shock. So it's the rear that needs all that preload adjustment. So that's why you still get a lot of bikes with no preload adjustment at the front. If it's been put there, it's been put there for a reason. Honda have put it there on my CB1100 to aid you getting that bike handling correctly. Aprilia put it on that Aprilia Touareg to compensate, to bring the front end down so the bike's not too choppered out with load. Let's think of another example. I did a video on the Triumph Tiger 900 Rally a while back, And that was on the way Triumph designed their front forks, in that there's a preload adjust on the front of those. And again, they don't want you to touch it. They don't want you to touch it on the road. Leave it, just leave it. Don't muck around with sag, don't worry about sag. We've chosen a spring rate. It'll sag whatever it's gonna sag, fine. You go loaded 2 up and all that sort of stuff. Don't worry about it. Just adjust your rear preload to compensate for that. Leave the front. Except when you go off-road. They want you to totally add maximum front preload on those front forks to bring the nose of the bike up, rake the bike out a bit, increase the trail, and give it stability for off-road. It is an off-road preload setting. That is it. That is absolutely it. So they're not looking for you to touch that preload to try and, you know, get your your fork sitting at a certain percentage through their stroke. They're just not looking for you to do that. So there's an example of a few bikes there. Bikes without front preload, like my GS, my Tiger, CB1100 there. They're using it for handling. I found that really sensitive to changes. So as I said in another video, I changed the tires on that CB1100 and the thing handled completely differently, and I could readjust that with that front preload. This piece here, which is kind of used in a slightly more traditional way, yeah, I managed to get kind of matching sags front and back, but at the end of the day, I actually didn't care too much about the sag value at the front. Once I got it kind of there or thereabouts, I used the front preload to change the handling of the bike. The Aprilia Touareg, as I said there, to aid the designers in that rear spring, they've given them some front preload at the front to compensate for heavy loads, 2-up passengers, that sort of stuff. And then the Tiger, where they're using front preload for an off-road specific purpose. So don't assume you know what front preload's for. Some user manuals are a bit infuriating. The Aprilia Touareg and the Tiger are very specific. This is what we want you to use it for. A lot of manuals say, you know, set your suspension for your conditions. Yeah. Does anyone want to elaborate on that? You know, we're not all physics teachers. You know, what do you mean by that? So, look, the Hondas particularly, you know, they just say, you know, set your suspension as you feel fit, sort of thing. Well, do you want to give us any clues? Any clues whatsoever? No. But it's very prescriptive with the Triumph and that Tiger 900, the Rally. That's that feature that is not on the GT variant of the Tiger 900. It doesn't need it. Yeah, everything's happening at the rear. You can deal with that with the preload at the rear. This is a sports bike. It's actually just a lead missile, really. It's too heavy to be a sports bike. But that front preload there is to adjust the handling. So read your user manual and find out what your manufacturer suggested your front preload was for, because it might not be for what you think it was. So what about you? Have you got any stories about front preload on your bike, or any different sort of ways it's used? Maybe any funny stories about front preload? What? Yeah, there might be a funny story about... Yeah, there might be a funny story about front preload out there. It's not beyond the realms of... Some people, they're just so, like, negative. I'll find one. Even the new Suzuki, the S1000, no, GSX S1000 GX, that has super duper, all electronic, semi-active suspension and everything like that, and unbelievable preload adjustment in the rear and everything like that. That has a little preload adjuster on the front fork, and that's for geometry adjustments. What's that? No, I just like cleaning the shiny bits. Yeah, well, you do the wheels. You won't. Oh, you think you can live in this cold, damp warehouse for free, do you? Fucking hell.